So I remember in the 1980s, I was just a young pup, but I remember in the 1980s, all the Democrats who just loved the Soviet Union. I remember being a little boy when Reagan was elected in 1980, and I remember Teddy Kennedy talking about the value of the Soviet Union. We had Democrat politicians who were flying over to the Soviet Union. Heck, in the early 80s, Bernie Sanders actually honeymooned with his wife in the Soviet Union, so devoted he was. I remember the time when the Democrats were apologizing for Soviet communism, were apologizing for the idea that America is in a better place if our power is balanced by a major Soviet juggernaut. And here we are 30, 40 years later, and the funny thing is that not much has changed. There's something about the Democrat Party, there's something about the Progressive Party in America that sees American enemies, America's stated enemies, as friends, because I guess the old maxim, the friend of my enemy is my friend, and we see it again today. So the same Democrats, people like Bernie Sanders, the ones that are still alive, the same Democrat Party that for years has been sympathetic to communism, particularly Soviet-style communism, is now suddenly, as we've seen for the last 3 years, decided that Russia is an enemy, because Russia is an enemy because they may have colluded with Donald Trump. Forget the fact that more evidence points to shenanigans between Hillary Clinton and the Russians or the CIA and the Russians with regards to some of these issues. The fact now remains that the Russians now are the bad guys, which is ironic because the Soviet Union's gone, and Russia, while still a quasi-dictatorial country, one with elections but with a guy like Putin in charge, former KGB, it's up to a lot of shenanigans. The irony, though, is that the same Democrats now are having a hard time criticizing China, communist China, which has the largest gulags in the world, which kills as many people internally as all the other countries of the nation combined. China, who has the Laogai, right, the formal concentration camps where Falun Gong protesters and all sorts of other individuals who have dared to defy the communist state are disappearing. Great, very shocking news stories in the last couple of weeks about organ harvesting, how Falun Gong practitioners of this alternative religion in China, Chinese practitioners are being ghosted. They're being disappeared into concentration camps. And it seems to be, credibly so, that there are organs are being harvested and utilized for other Chinese people, primarily Chinese communists, to help them stay alive. And so the question is, we talked a little bit a week ago or so about how the NBA and the big corporate sponsors, the big corporate movers and shakers of American culture, now too, they don't want to criticize China. They want to work with China. They're making money off China. The NBA makes billions off Chinese markets, Chinese merchandise. And so the great social justice warriors, the LeBron Jameses, the Kyrie Irvings, the great figureheads of the Nate Silver, the great figureheads of the NBA have decided now that we're going to protest American abuse on a small scale while ignoring wide-scale Chinese abuses. And that brings us back to our topic for the day, and that is the Democrat unwillingness to grant President Trump even the slightest bit of recognition or praise for having gotten ISIS leader Al-Baghdadi. I remember not just the 1980s, I remember 10 years ago when Obama, who fought his generals and fought his advisors, not wanting to conduct the raid that killed bin Laden. Sure took a lot of credit for it once it was done. Joe Biden, too. I remember those scenes from the war room where a gripping Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were steely-eyed in the presence of what was taking place. And because it was a successful raid, they took full credit for it. And I remember, too, not being a progressive, being proud of my country for having done that. I was a little bit disappointed in Obama that he had to be dragged kicking and screaming, but nevertheless a little proud that it had been done, that this blot on American and world liberty had been erased. But here we are, fast forward 10 plus years later, and we find ourselves in a situation where Donald Trump engaged in decisive action. He did not have to be dragged. He was 100% behind our special forces in going in and removing this guy, Al-Baghdadi, who is a serial rapist, is a guy who used to rape prisoners, including a young American girl who was ultimately tortured, raped, and murdered without ever turning her back on her Christian faith. She is a true martyr. And so it was just interesting and amusing to see the progressive left go out of their way to not give credit to Donald Trump. They were angry that Donald Trump didn't consult Nancy Pelosi on the raid. The idea that you think about the leaks that are coming from within Trump's own administration. You're going to turn this over to Nancy Pelosi, this information, and risk greater leaks that would actually have jeopardized the personnel who were involved in the raid. Absolute lunacy. And so this continues a pattern here, right? It's a pattern I had mentioned before, that to be a progressive in America means that your allegiance is not to the United States and it's not to the Constitution. This has never been clearer than it is now. Your allegiance is to anybody who stands athwart of American exceptionalism, American rules of law and order, American prosperity, American economic systems and free capitalism, free markets. If you are an enemy of those things in any way, which is a real short way of saying, if you are in any way a globalist, that you put the aims and ambitions of one world government over the aims and ambitions of a free people, a constitutional republic, and individual liberty, then you find yourself as a progressive today. And this is one of the most horrifying things, I think, is how far we've come since the time that Barack Obama was dragged into killing bin Laden. We find ourselves in a short decade in a place now where you actually have an entire political party and a progressive movement who is rooting against American success. When you read the stories in the Washington Post where they tried to define Baghdadi as an academic, as an intellectual, as a soft-spoken, shy cleric, knowing full well that he is a rapist and a murderer and the leader of one of the most vicious cults in all of world history, in modern world history, certainly. When you think about that kind of apologetics, when you have people on TV, talking heads, accusing Donald Trump of being worse than al-Baghdadi, when you have academics whining that somehow this was a brutal murder, that Donald Trump is responsible for murdering the babies, the children of Baghdadi, when in reality he's the one who blew himself up and those children. When you hear news anchors basically arguing that somehow Baghdadi was actually brave. He was brave because he killed himself. It takes a lot of courage to blow you and your kids up. And ultimately Max Boot, I'm talking about, who had to back that off and apologize for the way that came across. It is a weird place where we're in America, but it's a place of great moral clarity. We now know that this is not simple opposition. This is not just political disagreement. Remember when the shrill Hillary Clinton screeched at one point, dissent is patriotic. To dissent from anything George W. Bush did was patriotic, and that's come back again, right? They see it as patriotic, not to American values, but to their globalist agenda to oppose anything that happens to work right for America. There's a really good reason. You really don't hear many of the Democrat political candidates talking much about the economy. They're not talking about its successes. They're not talking about its employment. They're not talking full employment numbers. It's not talking about the triumph that is highest levels of employment for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for female Americans. That which is successful about this economy is not being discussed. On the other hand, what are they trying to do? They're telling you how if you elect them, whether you're talking about Warren or Sanders or Kamala Harris, what they're talking about again and again and again is the program that you elect us, we will transform your government. We will turn America into a socialist state. We will undermine the First and the Second Amendments. We will minimize the role of the Constitution in law and order. We will turn over the oversight of American justice and morality to global commissions. We will sign on to international treaties that will blunt and dull our own autonomy as a governing nation and a governing people. This is what they've promised you they're going to do. In a sense, they are preaching treason. This is constitutionally defined as treason. It's gotten interesting, hasn't it, that treason, as long as it's coming from a progressive, that we've been able to define treason, what you and I would call treason, what a reasonable American would call treason, that the progressive left has successfully defined as simply political dissent, and not just political dissent. As Hillary Clinton said, it's a form of patriotism. Let that sink in. It is patriotic to turn your back on America's Constitution, her values, her founding ideals, her liberties, her freedoms, her economic system. It is now patriotic to side with the communist Chinese in defending a worldview that is murderous and tyrannous. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Duke with The New American, and this has been my take on today's news.